There is a variable in wealth accumulation that rarely gets named. It's not intelligence, it's not strategy, it's not access to capital or information asymmetry. It's duration, specifically the ability to tolerate duration without stimulation. Most wealth is built by people who stayed in positions long past the point where those positions felt interesting, and most financially capable people exit before that point arrives, not because the position failed, because it stopped generating feedback. Compounding is a time-based phenomenon. It doesn't care about the quality of your thesis. It doesn't reward insight. It doesn't accelerate because you understand it. It requires one thing: continuous exposure over time. And continuous exposure over time is psychologically expensive, because most of that time is flat. No movement, no validation, no updates, just holding. And holding without feedback feels like inactivity, which for capable people feels like waste. There is a difference between time-weighted returns and behavior-weighted returns. Time-weighted returns measure what an asset does if you hold it. Behavior-weighted returns measure what you actually capture after accounting for when you enter, when you exit, and how often you interrupt the position. The gap between these two is not random. It's structural, and it's driven almost entirely by premature exits. People leave positions that were working, not because they stopped working, but because they stopped feeling productive. This pattern shows up everywhere: in equity holdings, in real estate, in careers, in businesses. The person who builds wealth is not the person who optimized entry timing. It's the person who stayed in the position through the middle. The middle is where most of the duration lives, and the middle is boring. No catalyst, no narrative, no external validation that you're doing the right thing, just time passing. And for someone who's intelligent, informed, and capable of seeing other opportunities, the middle becomes unbearable. There's a reason for this. Capable people are rewarded throughout their lives for activity, for learning new things, for solving problems, for applying intelligence to changing conditions. That reward structure builds a specific tolerance, a tolerance for novelty, for feedback, for measurable progress. But wealth accumulation doesn't operate on that cadence. Wealth accumulation rewards inactivity, specifically, the ability to do nothing while holding a position that requires time to mature. And doing nothing does not feel like competence. It feels like stagnation. So capable people exit, not because the position deteriorated, because the emotional texture of holding it became intolerable. Here's what that looks like in practice. Someone buys an asset: real estate, equity, a business stake. The first year is engaging. There's research, there's setup, there's learning. The second year is fine. There's some appreciation, some cash flow, enough feedback to confirm the position is working. The third year is flat. No major movement, no new information, nothing to optimize. And that's when the thought starts: is this still the best use of capital? That question sounds rational. It sounds like portfolio management. But what it actually is, most of the time, is boredom framed as diligence. The problem is not that the position stopped working. The problem is that it stopped generating novelty. And for someone whose brain is wired to process new information, solve new problems, and evaluate new opportunities, a flat position feels like dead weight. Even if it's compounding, even if exit would reset the clock, even if staying in would produce the outcome they claimed they wanted, they leave anyway, and they frame it as optimization. This is where opportunity cost becomes a psychological trap. Opportunity cost is real. Capital in one position is capital not available for another. But capable people overweight opportunity cost in flat periods and underweight it during active periods. When the position is moving, opportunity cost feels low. You're getting feedback. You're seeing appreciation. The position feels alive. When the position is flat, opportunity cost feels unbearable, because now you're aware of other positions that are moving, other assets appreciating, other sectors outperforming, other people capturing gains, and the comparison makes holding feel like a mistake. Even when holding is the entire mechanism, there's another dynamic. Wealth that compounds over long durations doesn't feel like wealth during most of that duration. It feels like waiting, because the majority of compounding happens in the final years, not the early ones. A position held for 10 years might produce 60% of its total return in the last 2, but you don't know that in year 3. In year 3, it just feels slow, and slow feels like you're falling behind. This explains why people with identical strategies end up with radically different wealth outcomes. It's not because one person had better information, it's because one person tolerated boredom longer. They stayed in the real estate deal through the refinance limbo. They stayed in the equity position through the flat years. They stayed in the business through the revenue plateau, not because they were more disciplined, not because they had more conviction, because they had higher tolerance for lack of stimulation. Boredom is not a trivial variable. It's one of the primary reasons positions get interrupted. People sell assets that are appreciating slowly. They leave careers that are compounding optionality. They exit businesses during consolidation phases, and they frame it as strategic repositioning. But what actually happened is they ran out of patience for flatness. The other issue is that financial media and peer environments reward activity. No one talks about the position they've held for 8 years. They talk about the new position, the new sector, the new thesis, the thing they just deployed into. So the person holding quietly, doing nothing, tolerating the middle, gets no social reinforcement. They're not learning anything new. They're not sharing insights. They're not positioning themselves as informed. They're just holding. And holding doesn't generate status. So even if it's generating wealth, it feels like you're falling behind in the other game. The game of appearing competent. There's a survivorship bias in long-term wealth. When you look at people who built significant wealth, the story always emphasizes the decision to enter, the decision to buy, the decision to start, the decision to take the position. What doesn't get emphasized is the decision to stay through the boring middle, to stay when the position stopped being interesting, to stay when other opportunities looked better. Because staying isn't a decision, it's the absence of decision. And the absence of decision doesn't make for a compelling story, but it's the majority of the outcome. This is why time in market dominates timing the market. It's not about entry precision, it's about duration. And duration requires one thing most capable people don't have: tolerance for doing nothing when doing nothing feels unproductive. Chapter 15. The Reset Trap. The person who exits after 3 years and redeploys into a new position resets the clock. They're starting over, not from 0, but from year 1 of the new duration curve. And if they do that every 3 years, they're always in year 1, 2, or 3. Never in year 7, never in year 10, never in the phase where compounding accelerates. The person who stays bored stays in the position long enough to reach the back half of the curve, where the returns aren't linear anymore, where time does the work, and they don't stay because they have better conviction. They stay because they have higher tolerance for emotional flatness. This is not an argument that all positions should be held forever. Some positions do deteriorate, some theses break, but most exits are not driven by thesis failure. They're driven by boredom, by impatience, by the feeling that you should be doing something, and doing something interrupts the only mechanism that actually builds wealth at scale: uninterrupted exposure over long time horizons. Here's the structural problem. You can't know in advance which positions will require long holds, and you can't know during the flat middle whether you're in a position that will pay off or one that won't. So the only way to capture long duration returns is to accept that most of the holding period will feel unproductive, and most capable people can't do that. Not because they lack discipline, because their entire reward history has trained them to interpret inactivity as failure. The person who stayed bored longer than you didn't have a better strategy. They didn't see something you missed. They didn't have more capital, more access, or more insight. They just had a higher tolerance for the absence of feedback, for holding positions that weren't generating novelty, for staying in the middle when the middle felt like nothing was happening. And the middle is where wealth gets built. Not at entry, not at exit, in the long, boring middle that most people leave before it compounds. If you've exited positions that were working, if you've redeployed capital because the current position felt slow, If you've told yourself you were optimizing when what you were actually doing was escaping boredom. You're not undisciplined, you're not impatient. You're responding exactly as your competence and environment trained you to. But the outcome is the same. You interrupted duration. And duration was the mechanism. Wealth isn't built by people who make better decisions. It's built by people who make fewer decisions, who stay in positions long enough for time to do what intelligence can't, and who tolerate the emotional cost of that time. Boredom, flatness, the absence of feedback. That's the structure.